Precisely 100 years after the disaster, the word Titanic still sends a dark chill through Canadian homes.
What we had here was a disaster that was unimaginable.
The world knows a version of events.
Danger on a ship like this? Oh, nonsense.
Hollywood has made sure of that.
Do not let go of my hand!
But what really happened, April 15th, 1912.
In fact, as he said, he would have taken another liner had he known that Captain Smith was the captain of the ship.
There were 130 people bound for Canada. It's time their hidden histories were told.
Just get in the lifeboat and everything will be fine. We never even kissed him goodbye.
I'm Anne-Marie MacDonald. In this special doc zone, those closest to the story make the night to remember a night never forgotten. A cold morning in February 2012. A U.S. Coast Guard Hercules takes off from St. John's, Newfoundland. Its destination, the North Atlantic.
Attack positive cargo points and capture.
Its mission, to pinpoint and map every iceberg in the waters off the east coast of Canada. Every year, the International Ice Patrol performs this task. Born out of the most famous marine disaster of the 20th century. Titanic. The Canadian story still echoes through the generations from coast to coast. Almost 5,000 kilometers to the south, in the land of country and western music, lies the last place you'd expect to find a shrine to this great ship.
Is this the scale? Is this the actual scale?
I think it's a quarter scale. I don't know the exact.
Yet every year, tens of thousands of people flock to the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri.
And of course, the rear end of it ain't there at all.
I'm impressed. Really, really.
There were 130 people bound for Canada on the ill-fated luxury liner's maiden voyage.
That must be the skylight.
Here, this is where the engine rooms were.
These are their descendants. 100 years later, they've come to learn, to share, and to honor the memory of their families.
My grandmother's cabin would have been right along here on sea deck. So the iceberg came along right underneath her, about a quarter of the ship's length.
Reconnecting with these stories of survival and loss is an emotional experience for them.
This is boat 6.
Accompanying the group, Alan Hustack, journalist and author of Titanic, the Canadian Story.
The interesting thing is that the lifeboats were loaded not from the promenade deck, but they were loaded from this deck.
From this deck, yes.
They brought them down to this level, and there was a lot of confusion.
Welcome, everyone. Now, this is our beautiful, beautiful, beautiful grand staircase. Now, you are definitely in first class, as you should be.
It is here in Branson that their family's stories come to life. RMS Titanic. 100 years later, the name still conjures up images of the incredible wealth and size of the White Star luxury liners.
The Titanic really was a floating Versailles. It was 3 football fields long.
But also of unspeakable tragedy. The unsinkable ship became a cautionary tale for the ages.
There was this belief that if you defied God, that God would cut you down to size. Basically, Titanic, in many sermons, was preached as being God's retribution for man's hubris.
Before you go up, I've got some very, very special people, I think, here. Who do we have here, anyway? Well, my goodness, Charles Hayes, anyone?
Yes.
Oh, well, there you are. Adolf Solfeld. Now, where should he be? Oh, my goodness, here's Adolf Solfeld for you. And let's see, Nishan Krikorian. You're good looking like he was. How about the Fortune family? I love that name. I think they should make a musical out of that whole family. I truly do.
Thank you.
For the passengers bound for Canada, some already called it home. Others chose it as a place of opportunity or refuge. And they came from all walks of life. 36 in first class, including servants, 29 in second class, and 67 in steerage. Robert Rutherford's great-grandfather was in first class with his wife, 3 daughters, and youngest son.
I think of my grandmother and her sisters walking down that staircase, and it sends shivers up my spine. It's remarkable.
Nishan Krikorian was in steerage. His grandson, Van Solomonian.
Well, this has no relevance to me, and I'm sure it had no relevance to him because he never saw any of this. Being in third class, they were basically locked below in the steerage compartment, so they had no concept of what first class was actually enjoying above them.
First class bedroom stateroom of John Jacob Astor, everyone. Keep coming.
Wow.
1912 was a year of optimism. Canada, just over 50 years old, was bursting with activity. The Quebec Bulldogs won the Stanley Cup. In Ottawa, a gleaming new Chateau Laurier opened its doors. And in Alberta, a humble rodeo show eventually became the Calgary Stampede.
At this particular time, Toronto was really a Presbyterian backwater, and the wealthiest cities of Canada were Montreal and Winnipeg.
And that's where the aptly named Fortune family made their riches. Winnipeg was producing more millionaires per capita than any other city in North America.
My great-grandfather was Mark Fortune, a self-made and very wealthy man who lived in Winnipeg. They were traveling first class on the Titanic. They had done the grand tour of Europe all the way to Egypt and back, and sailed the Titanic as a final treat for the family.
Nothing would deter them. Not even when Alice Fortune had an ominous encounter with a soothsayer.
You are in danger every time you travel on the sea. For I see you adrift on the ocean in an open boat. You will lose everything but your life.
From Montreal came one of Canada's most prominent businessmen and his family. Charles Melville Hayes was the president of the Grand Trunk Railway. In April 1912, Hayes was in London to raise funds for a railway expansion.
So he was there, Clara went with him.
Valerie Annawalt and her sister Orion Green are his great-granddaughters.
They had word that their third daughter was going to have a very difficult birth of her son, and so they decided they would cut their trip short. And they were offered passage on the Titanic, so they were not supposed to be on the ship at all.
Ironically, Charles Hayes made a gloomy prediction to his fellow passengers not long after boarding.
The time will come when the race to build the fastest transatlantic ship will result in the greatest and most appalling disaster.
It wasn't hard to both marvel and be a little frightened by the Titanic and its twin, the Olympic. Both had been built side by side in Belfast, and everything about the ships was a blueprint of human ingenuity. The very name, Titanic, said it all.
It was the ultimate luxurious vessel. Their boast that it was the ship of dreams. In 1912, indeed, it was the most advanced vessel that could be built.
The first to be launched, the Olympic, got all the publicity. But the Titanic would be the one to be remembered. And yet, these are the only two moving images of the great ship. On April 10th, 1912, shortly before noon, with bells ringing, handkerchiefs waving, and a blast of the biggest whistles in the world, the Titanic left Southampton on its maiden voyage. The ship would stop in Cherbourg, France first, and make a second stop in Queenstown, Ireland, before heading out for the 6-day crossing to New York. At the helm was Captain E.J. Smith, a 62-year-old veteran of the White Star Line. Despite an accident with the Olympic a year earlier, he was a popular choice amongst most passengers, except for one Canadian. Arthur Peuchen was a wealthy businessman from Toronto. He was also an experienced yachtsman who had crossed the Atlantic 40 times. His great-great-nephew, Alan Gillespie.
When he got on the Titanic, he did not realize that Captain Smith was the captain. In fact, as he said, he would have taken another liner had he known that Captain Smith was the captain of the ship.
Once aboard the Titanic, the Hayes clan quickly settled into their luxurious cabins. The Fortune family did the same, oblivious to Peuchen's concerns. The White Star liners offered so much to see and do. The swimming baths, the gym, the reading room, and the food. The kitchens of both Titanic and Olympic were almost as impressive as the engine rooms. Adolf Saalfeld, Astra Burka's great-great-uncle, longed to share his experience.
He was a chemist and perfumer by trade, and he wrote a letter to his wife on the first day when he was on board. So far, the boat does not move and goes very steadily. It is not nice to travel alone and leave you behind. I think you will have to come next time.
It was in Cherbourg, France, that the Baxter family from Montreal came aboard, with some unexpected baggage.
Quig Baxter was a hockey player. He had played with the Montreal Shamrocks. And in the adjoining cabin was his sister, Zette, and his mother, who came from a very distinguished and very aristocratic French-Canadian family, but she didn't have very much money. She wanted to live in the Square Mile, which was a Protestant enclave, even though she was French-Canadian and Catholic. To satisfy his wife, Mr. Baxter, who was a banker, dipped into funds from the bank, and he was eventually caught and sent to prison.
Shunned by Montreal society, Mrs. Baxter wintered in Europe every year. Heading for home, her family occupied the second most expensive staterooms on the Titanic, right next door to that of the president of the White Star Line himself, Bruce Ismay. But unbeknownst to his mother, Quig had installed a Belgian cabaret singer in a cabin on the deck below. Although she was using one of her many stage names to travel, Berthe de Villiers, her real name was Berthe Menet. Berthe was described by a Belgian newspaper as well known in Brussels in circles of pleasure, and was often seen in the company of people who liked to wine and dine and enjoy life. She most likely met Quig Baxter at the Hotel Metropole.
I think it was an impromptu love affair. Quig met her in a bar and was instantly smitten. I think that he had the wherewithal and the desire to at least have a fling with her a transatlantic fling during the voyage.
Elle date de 1909.
Berthe's family acknowledges she had a penchant for luxury and rich men, and she had always told them fabulous stories about her Canadian lover.
Et alors bon, ils se sont connus et apparemment ça a été l'amour fou. En tout cas du côté de Quick, elle, on a toujours une petite suspicion,
oui,
mais pourquoi pas?
Mais pourquoi pas? Apparemment, elle devait y tenir.
Voilà, elle devait y tenir énormément. Et donc bon voilà, c'est l'amour fou, l'amour absolument fou entre ces deux jeunes gens. Ils ont 24 et 25 ans, donc vraiment c'est l'amour fou. Et ben Quick décide de la marier tout simplement.
Also boarding in Cherbourg, French sculptor Paul Chevret. Chevret didn't have any mistresses, but it was rumored he had something almost as valuable on board the Titanic, a large bust of Sir Wilfrid Laurier, commissioned by Charles Hayes for his new hotel in Ottawa. Chevret had made quite a name for himself in Canada, particularly in Quebec. Today, in parks, hotels, on busy streets, even the Quebec legislature, his sculptures still retain their prominence. But in France, Chevret had few projects. His most elaborate work is this wedding room, done with his father in the city hall in Asnières. Not enough to live on, Chevret found himself often making the crossing to Canada. Historian Olivier Mendez.
Paul Chevret was not a great traveler. He didn't like water. And the Titanic was just a bit too big for him. And he wasn't feeling very, very happy about this trip.
Also boarding in Cherbourg was Nishan Krikorian, a young Armenian man fleeing the turmoil and persecution plaguing the Armenian people.
He had no idea of what was the comfort level and the conveniences of first or second class, and I don't think he cared because his objective was to get from A to B. It wasn't a cruise that he was going on for fun. It was to get to Canada so he could start his new life.
The last stop before setting out to cross the Atlantic was in Queenstown, Ireland, today known as Cove. Last letters were mailed, luggage and passengers loaded. The ship was stocked for the final leg of the journey to New York. Among those boarding in steerage class was a young Irish girl named Bridget Bradley, another passenger heading off for a better life in the New World. In fact, the Titanic made its money not on the few rich first-class passengers, but the many in steerage. Mary Higgins of Gananoque, Ontario, is Bridget's daughter.
I think it was very hard because her parents were poor and the children were coming so close together. Her mother and father heard about the Titanic and thought, well, they praised it unsinkable, and they thought it was be a good chance for her to go.
On April 11th, the Titanic, now stocked and ready, set sail majestically from Ireland to New York. No one imagined that these would be the last images ever taken of the great ship. On April 14th, while the Titanic was plowing through the ocean at a brisk 22 knots, determined to arrive in New York early on the 17th, nearby ships were sending urgent wires about icebergs to its Marconi operator, Jack Phillips. But he was too busy transmitting passengers' messages to pay attention. Their messages were relayed through Cape Race, Newfoundland, the most easterly point of land in North America. On this foggy, barren cape, Dave Myrick's family worked at the Marconi station.
Quite a few ships in the traffic lanes that night warned the Titanic of bergs in the area, but Phillips, I guess up to his ears passing the traffic that he had, replied, shut up, I'm working Cape Race, you know. So.
and welcome to April on the North Atlantic.
Oh my, look at the stars.
The starlit night, just like you see. The sky was described as being ablaze with stars. No wind, no moon, no waves. All that made for a very beautiful night, but it made it very difficult to see anything out there.
Suddenly, those earlier warnings became all too real. At 11:40 p.m., a giant iceberg loomed in the darkness. 37 seconds later, the Titanic's fate was sealed. French sculptor Paul Chevret immediately sensed something was very wrong.
Paul Chevret was playing cards, and just after the bump, he went on deck to see what happened. He didn't speak English, so he didn't understand, and what the crew was saying made him more and more nervous.
For passengers like Grand Trunk President Charles Hayes, the situation didn't seem that serious.
Well, he was so confident that the ship was safe that he really didn't take into account that there could be anything going on wrong. And what was it that he said?
Oh, he said, I'll see you in a couple of hours. Just get in the lifeboat and everything will be fine. And my Aunt Orion said later he was so casual we never even kissed him or my husband goodbye.
Meanwhile, the first distress call was made.
CQD, SOS, we have struck iceberg. Sinking fast. Come to our assistance.
Quig Baxter was the first passenger to understand how serious the situation was.
As soon as the ship hits the iceberg, Smith goes down to Ismay's cabin. And I know this because Quig Baxter is probably the first passenger, because he sticks his head out the door and he sees Smith and Ismay conferring. And at that point, Ismay turns to the hockey player and he says, "The ship is in trouble. Get your mom and sister off."
Below in steerage, Nishan Krikorian saw the panic starting and headed for the deck.
In a minute, there was chaos and confusion. Women rushed hither and thither, and then the lights went out.
He had this strong will to survive, and he had this opportunity where on boat 10 it wasn't full and it was being lowered, and he instinctively just jumped in at the last moment as it was being lowered, and that saved his life.
The stern will be back here.
The lifeboats of the Titanic.
I still can't believe this is a full scale.
Who lived and who died was decided here.
We talk about what people would do. I think when there's a time of danger, everyone reacts differently.
Like Chevret. Chevret pocketed his cards, and Chevret had enough experience. He wasn't going to wait. He was one of the first people off, as you know.
Paul Chevret found himself at the right place at the right time on a night when all else went wrong.
He was standing near lifeboat number 7, and one of the crew members told them to board the lifeboat, and that's how he found himself, just by chance, on board the first lifeboat to leave the sinking ship.
Quig Baxter, who had been given advance warning, quickly got his mother and sister to lifeboat 6. There was no time for tact.
So he went down, fetched Bertha Main, brought her up, and led his mother and his sister and his girlfriend to boat number 6. And at that point, he introduces his girlfriend to his mother and sister and basically says, "Look after her, au revoir." And with that, he stepped back to his death.
Arthur Puchin was ordered into that same lifeboat.
Lifeboat number 6 was going down without any males, all females, and of course, half empty in this case. And somebody asked him if he was had sea experience, and he said he was a yachtsman. So at age 53, he swung out on the davit and climbed down, hand over hand, down the rope.
The situation was rapidly becoming critical. Telegrams were being fired off.
We are sinking fast.
In Cape Race, Dave Myrick's great-uncle Jimmy was alone in the wireless room when he heard history.
Young Jimmy was listening. He heard the CQD SOS from the Titanic.
Passengers being put into boats.
He rushed out through the door to let his supervisor know.
Meanwhile, the Carpathia, a Cunard liner, was 93 kilometers to the southeast of the Titanic. Racing to the rescue, the captain counted at least 24 icebergs, at least 200 feet high, and dozens of smaller ones. It wasn't long before everyone on board understood that the Titanic was in serious trouble. The flares signaled what so many had refused to believe.
Mrs. Fortune, Mary Fortune, and her 3 daughters were all embarked in lifeboat number 10. Charles and Mark stood by and watched it happen. In fact, the girls then took off their jewelry and handed it back to Charles on board the ship and said, you know, take care of these and take care of Father. And that was the parting words.
In Lifeboat 3, Clara Hayes stubbornly clung to hope.
After the boats were lowered, she was calling Charles, Charles, Charles Hayes for a long, long time.
Then the last message at 1:45.
Engine room full up to the boilers.
Just over 2 hours after it hit the iceberg, at 2:20 a.m., the unsinkable Titanic went down. "12-year-old Bertha Watt witnessed the ship's final moments.
About 2 o'clock, we heard the boilers burst. And then she broke in two and slid into the water, leaving nothing to be seen. We were then left entirely alone in the dark, except for the stars.
In these frigid waters, 1,500 people lost their lives. 82 of the Canadian-bound passengers died. That terrible moment haunted Paul Chevret for life.
That's really what he saw every time he closed his eyes. I think that until his very last hour, he could hear the cries of people dying.
At 4 a.m., as dawn was breaking, the Carpathia finally arrived and picked up the first survivors who'd been bobbing in the water for almost 4 hours. Their stories were about to become the 20th century's first major media event, and they would turn the Titanic into a legend. News of the unsinkable Titanic hitting an iceberg spread like wildfire. In a matter of hours, headlines appeared around the globe. Historian Michael Dupuy.
In journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. And so this story was just made for selling copies. People couldn't get enough information and get enough news.
Some papers reported all passengers saved. No one believed the ship could go down.
Some newspapers didn't even bother to report it at all, on the grounds that this unsinkable ship could not sink.
Anxious family members were frantic, flooding the White Star offices in New York, London, and Southampton, desperate to get some reliable news.
The world was on tenterhooks, wanting to know who had survived, how many had survived. The messages were being extremely mixed.
The newspapers churned out new editions every time a bit of information trickled in. The Montreal Daily Star's first edition insisted Titanic still afloat. In the second edition, White Star officials certain Titanic is safe. By the third and fourth editions, the anxious public was given a much darker picture. But when all wireless messages from the Titanic ceased, the world finally had its answer.
In New York, at 2:20 in the morning, Carl Van Anda, who is the editor of the New York Times, says, hey, if there are no more signals, she's gone down. And he makes the dare, takes the gamble, and the next morning, the New York Times has the headline, the Titanic's gone down to the bottom.
In New York City, where the Carpathia was bound, a press firestorm erupted, with over 500 journalists, wire service correspondents, telegraph operators, and artists descending to cover the story of the century.
So you had journalists from all over the world trying by all devious means to get onto the deck. You had all kinds of people encouraging people to throw messages in bottles. It was a madhouse.
Among them, more than 20 Canadian news correspondents. Mary Snyder was one of those reporters. As part of the team from the Toronto Telegram, her job was to get to the Canadians on board. But it was not going to be easy.
The New York City authorities and the White Star Line people decided they would only issue passes to New York press associations and 2 British papers. But it definitely excluded all out-of-town reporters and every Canadian reporter.
Undeterred, Mary Snyder got the scoop of her career.
And what she did is when an ambulance stopped to show credentials to the police, she asked a young man who stepped out of the ambulance, would you let me come in? I need to get this story. And he said, well, I'm sorry, I can't do that for you, but you can ask the doctor here.
Dr. Spear, will you take me? I've been at the custom house all day and I cannot get a pass. Get in with Miss Smith and mind you're a nurse. The pier doors open wide. The ambulance entered the portals which were closed to multi-millionaires.
Although the newspaper artists could illustrate the horror of that night, the reporters knew that the survivors' first-hand accounts were what mattered. Bridget Bradley was interviewed while recovering in hospital.
We saw the bottom row of lights disappear under the water and watched as line after line disappeared, showing us the rapidity of the sinking of the ship. We were entirely surrounded by large cakes of ice, and there was no food or water on the boat.
Suzette Baxter shared a haunting image with the Toronto Evening Telegram.
We could hear revolver shots all over, and the confusion was terrible. The last I saw of my brother, Mr. Quig Baxter, he was standing on the deck, fastening a life preserver around him.
But in the media circus around them, the Baxter women were less anxious to reveal another part of Quig's story. Everyone wanted to know who the hooded Berthe Menet was.
When they arrive in New York, to avoid the scandal, the press are told that she is Mrs. de Villiers instead of Quig's girlfriend, and the story is that they had met her on the ship and that she was on a world tour.
As fact and fiction became interwoven, the truth sometimes got in the way of a good story. An English-language newspaper report wove a fictional tale that infuriated Paul Chevret.
And of course, Chevret, when he discovered what was being printed about him in English, stormed into the offices of La Presse in Montreal and demanded, and indeed gave a 2-page interview at the time, correcting all of the mistakes.
I never said I saw the captain of the Titanic kill himself, nor did I say I saw a lifeboat sink before my eyes. And lastly, the bust of Sir Wilfrid Laurier was not in my cabin, and therefore not lost at sea.
Chevret wanted to set the record straight, and once done, he never spoke of the Titanic story again. Most of the survivors wanted to forget the horrifying trauma of that night. But for some, the taint of lies and suspicion was harder to erase. This was especially true of the men who survived. Few, however, felt the bite of social ostracism more than Arthur Peuchen. Despite being ordered to row a lifeboat, Peuchen knew he would face the public's wrath.
Shortly after, the society turned on him and said, you know, you're the man that got off, and he said he was a yachtsman, and they say that had the ship been on fire, he would have claimed that he was a fireman.
He was again ostracized by polite society, and ostracized to the point that he basically left Toronto and spent his final days alone out in Alberta.
For Nishan Krikorian, the criticism was tainted with something more sinister.
Because he was an Armenian and because he couldn't speak English, there was this, at the time, a superiority that he was somehow a coward. He was an immigrant coward.
100 years later, the stiff British code of honor that defined that terrible night still weighs heavily on the families. Charles Hayes and his son-in-law both went down with the ship.
I think that it was the proper thing to do. It was the turn of the century. It was something that a gentleman would not jump into a lifeboat until the women were taken care of and the children were taken care of.
It's really something.
Nishan Krikorian's family have no regrets.
I've always been a firm believer in fate. There was some reason why he survived. I don't know why, but as a result, he was able to bring his two brothers over. I don't know, everything happens for a reason.
Maybe Chevret was the first one who really realized that something had changed in his life, because he had survived as a man when so many women and children had lost their lives. He never really recovered mentally and physically from the sinking of the ship. He couldn't survive the Titanic. He couldn't survive being a survivor.
We found 50 bodies, all in a group. They were like a flock of white seagulls at rest on the sea.
The grim recovery mission had begun, and the city of Halifax was front and center of the operations. Vessels were chartered by its White Star office in Nova Scotia to retrieve the Titanic's victims. The Mackie Bennett left Halifax 2 days after the disaster. Within a week, it had collected more than 306 bodies. 116 were so badly disfigured, they were buried at sea. The Mackie Bennett's cable engineer, Frederick A. Hamilton, kept a diary of the gruesome mission.
Even in death, social protocol was observed. Those bodies identified as being from third class were stacked in a heap on deck. Second class dead were sewn into canvas bags, and those from first class were laid out in coffins on the Mackie Bennett's poop deck.
A crew member aboard another death ship, the Minia, wrote to his mother.
The first body we picked up was C.M. Hayes of G-Trunk Rail. It was no trouble to identify him, as he had a lot of papers on him and a watch with his name on.
When he was discovered, he was wearing his watch with this chain, and the watch stopped at exactly the moment that they think he drowned.
Charles Melville Hayes' body was brought back to Montreal on his own private railway car.
It really just bowls me over, the luxury of it, the fact that someone could have this kind of a thing.
His death was greeted with shock throughout the country, and there were funerals in England and in Montreal. And then to cap things off, the entire rail line stopped. Wherever the trains were running, they immediately stopped in their tracks. Homage was paid to Charlie Hayes.
However, for the family, that attention came at a price.
Quite a lot of sort of negative publicity. Some rich swells have their own cars coming. It did have the unintended consequences of their being singled out as being privileged and getting extra special treatment. And I think that was very painful for my family.
Meanwhile, the search for more bodies continued. The White Star chartered another boat, the Montmagny, led by its captain, François-Xavier Pouliot. Captain Michel Pouliot is his grandson.
The challenges were the weather. It's often foggy in that area. At that time, there was no radar, of course, and when they did come around the field of debris that was floating and then started picking up the bodies, I can imagine it brought home the immensity of the tragedy.
Of all the stories passed down in this family of mariners, one of his grandfather's Titanic tales still haunts Michel Pouliot.
It was calm, and as the body was sent over the railing into the sea for the official burial at sea, a small gust of wind rang the bell of the Montmagny. It was as if there was some invisible action taken to salute the end of a life.
Halifax, more than any other Canadian city at the time, understood the perils of the sea. Many livelihoods were made on the water, and drowning was a fact of life. But still, as each death ship returned to Halifax, unloading its tragic cargo on the wharves, 209 victims in all, the city mourned. Gary Schutlock, senior government archivist.
Was probably about 70 churches. And all these bells were tolling as the ship was traveling up the harbor to the flag wharf in the dockyard. There were people lining the wharfs, very solemn, very somber, waiting for the ship to arrive.
At the Mayfair Curling Club, each body was put into its own wooden coffin with a number on its chest in the hope that it could be identified. Most were buried here.
Here we are in Fairview Lawn Cemetery, which is where the largest number of bodies from Titanic are buried. They are just behind me over here. The White Star Line went out of their way to arrange for burial plots for all of the victims who were recovered, and also arranged that headstones would be erected for all of those people who were unidentified.
The Titanic tragedy touched a nerve in Halifax. The city that had always welcomed new arrivals to Canada now found itself receiving those who never made it.
The people who were on board the ship were not only coming to North America to have a new life, and they were going to populate Canada from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. And these would have been a future lieutenant governor, a Prince of Premier, a scientist, inventor.
In the eulogies for the victims, a solemn promise was made to those who died.
They shall rest quietly in our midst under the murmuring pines and hemlocks, but their story shall be told to our children and our children's children.
How true those words turned out to be. A 100 years later, the tragedy of the Titanic still lives on. Hi, I'm Anne-Marie MacDonald. You are watching a special edition of Doc Zone, Titanic, the Canadian story. It is a tragedy in which mythology and romance have all but eclipsed the facts.
It just didn't happen that way. It was a horror story.
100 years ago, across the country, they scoured the papers for news of survivors among the 130 people bound for Canada.
That's my grandmother right there.
To this day, the tragedy remains deeply personal family history.
The question is, are survivors really survivors?
Four and a half kilometers beneath the North Atlantic she lies. 600 kilometers southeast of Newfoundland. A testament to one of the greatest disasters of the 20th century. The discovery of the Titanic made the legend come to life again. We now saw her size, her majesty, and clues to what happened on that night to remember, April 15th, 1912. The Titanic has always seized our imagination. It was a tale of greed, hubris, and human error. Some 1,500 lives lost, including 82 passengers bound for Canada. Among the passengers were titans of industry, immigrants, farmers, businessmen. Some already called Canada home. Others were hoping it would be a new beginning. But for all on board that night, no one expected what was to come.
What we had here was a disaster that was unimaginable. This was an unsinkable ship on her maiden voyage that had gone down. It was the first great disaster of the 20th century.
From the moment the Titanic sank, it was the dream of many explorers to find its final resting place. Lured by the secrets the Titanic might still hold, they hatched one improbable scheme after another. But the great ship remained elusive. It seemed the unsinkable Titanic would remain lost forever, too deep for anyone to reach. That all changed on September 1st, 1985. A team led by oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard finally pinpointed the wreck. It took almost 75 years of technology for this moment to happen. Triumphant, he returned to a hero's welcome. Ballard became a modern-day Magellan, and the Titanic didn't disappoint those looking to find the underwater Holy Grail. Newscasts trumpeted the story as one of the great finds of the 20th century.
Searchers today confirmed they found the Titanic in about 4 kilometers of water.
Spurred on by Ballard's discovery, others converged on the site. One of them was P.H. Nargeolet, a captain in the French Navy and a veteran of many deep-sea dives. But none surpassed his first encounter with the Titanic in 1987.
I remember when we arrived for the first time at the Titanic, for almost 10 minutes, nobody was talking in the sub. Everybody was looking through the portholes. I remember a beautiful picture of the Titanic. It's the chandelier. You know, the chandeliers are, some of them are absolutely beautiful because they were with glass pearl and with gold, and they are still there. That is very impressive.
But for the families of both victims and survivors, Titanic's discovery opened old wounds.
There's Mother at her graduation.
Don Marshall's mother was the last living Canadian survivor.
I know Mother wasn't happy about the aggrandizing of the whole thing. Her approach was, and particularly when that first submersible went down and found the wreck, she was really angry that they had done that. She said, "That's a gravesite. You need to leave it alone."
But divers like P.H. Nargeolet believe exploring the wreck is an obligation to history. He is associated with the company RMS Titanic, which has owned the salvaging rights since 1987. During that time, they have recovered more than 5,500 artifacts, putting them on display in museums around the world.
Suppose we did nothing, okay? In 1 century or 1.5 century, the people will say, well, we have nothing about this history. We have nothing.
This picture fascinates me about Adolf because it's kind of the perfumer in him.
Canadian filmmaker Astra Burka feels the objects salvaged in the wreck should be returned to the families. Her great-great-uncle Adolf Saalfeld was a perfume manufacturer from Manchester, England. When the Titanic went down, he survived, but the precious vials disappeared into the deep. Unbelievably, divers retrieved those perfume bottles decades later, the scent still intact.
I just was fascinated by the smell of it because it's just like smelling 90 years or 80 years.
The perfume became part of an exhibition, and Astra's family wasn't informed or acknowledged.
I found it kind of a little bit odd because it was like we didn't exist, and they're kind of being displayed in a, you know, and we're not part of the story.
This is the one where he grabs his life jacket.
Right.
The discovery of the perfume inspired Astra to create a unique tribute to her relative. This animated film is simply called My Titanic Uncle. And it features a letter Adolf Saalfeld wrote to his wife aboard the ship.
I have made a very good dinner, and first had 2 cigars in the smoke room, and shall now go to bed as I am tired. I am posting this letter tonight. A kiss for you.
Astra Burka may mourn the loss of those perfume vials, but for other Canadian Titanic families, selling those mementos seemed like the best option.
We decided that it was a valuable piece of history, and that having it sit inside the family was not necessarily appropriate, and who would have it?
Dawn Marshall's mother, Bertha Watt, was a young Scottish girl from Aberdeen. She and her mother were aboard the Titanic, bound for a new life in a new world. They survived, and a few years later, she recounted her ordeal in a high school newspaper article.
The port side of the ship was very much crowded, so we went round to the starboard side. We had neither compass, light, matches nor water, and were out quite a long time before we could find the rudder.
Bertha eventually settled in British Columbia. When she died, Dawn Marshall's family had to make a decision about her possessions, which included the essay and a passenger list.
And so we said, we'll sell it out to somebody who really wants it, to a collector.
These were recovered from a first-class steward, William Denton Cox. Very, very important items, worth between $40,000 and $70,000.
This is the sort of place Dawn Marshall's mementos would end up. At an auction house just outside London, England, rare Titanic artifacts are going on the block.
The interest lies in the human angle, the people. You have over 2,200 passengers and crew on that ship. So in effect, you have 2,200 different stories to tell. This is a plan of first-class accommodation for the Titanic. As you can see, in effect, it's a roadmap of the ship, and this item is expected to sell for between $40,000 and $60,000.
That's $10,000. 11.
About 100 people have assembled for the sale.
17. 18. 18. 20.
Several more are making their bids by telephone, and it doesn't take long before the tension rises.
At £27,000, am I down?
It's yours.
Generally speaking, collectors don't fit any particular profile. Age groups can vary from early 20s to men in their 70s, 80s, even their 90s. And it's just, they're fascinated in the subject and they'd like to own, in essence, a piece of history.
Well, this cup and saucer is actually from the Titanic.
That's how Rene Bergeron sees it. He is a serious Titanic collector.
I'm definitely in the top of the game. In the short span, I've got lucky through life with people donating some very important pieces of my collection and getting really good deals out there.
Bergeron has the largest accumulation of Titanic memorabilia in Canada and is considered to be among the top 5 in North America. His items range from postcards to dishware, and it all started with a visit to the grocery store.
Whenever they found the wreck, and there was a Popular Mechanics magazine right at the checkout, and I saw the magazine and it had the ship on the cover, and I said to my mom, "Can I have it?" It's a cigarette tin. When you would have bought it, it had cigarettes, and what makes this one here special is that on the inside it actually has Titanic in there, and it mentions the maiden voyage.
Today, Rene Bergeron has over 1,000 pieces in his collection, including this tiny section of the original Grand Staircase.
I collect because it's my passion and because I like the items. I connect with them. It's part of history. It's so well known that it'll never be forgotten. But then hopefully it's like my generation and the generations following will have to do their work and pass on that knowledge.
Captain Michel Pouliot owns one piece of Titanic history that has been in his family's possession since the sinking. Pouliot's grandfather was the captain of the Montmagny, a ship sent out from Halifax 3 weeks after the disaster to retrieve more victims. He only found 4 bodies, but one changed his life.
One of them was a young chap immigrating for a better life by the name of Harold Reynolds. He was found in a life ring, and he was found hanging by the grab rope that are fixed to life rings of that nature. And that also was something that marked my grandfather, because he took that life ring home. And I believe to always remember this great tragedy and the role that he had played. Well, this is the life ring brought home by my grandfather.
Today, the life ring would fetch a hefty price on the Titanic market, but this artifact won't be going anywhere.
Well, it's been protected by my will. It's not for sale, never will be. It's with the Pouliot family. It's the presence of my grandfather.
Hey kids, how are you doing today?
Rene Bergeron uses his collection to entertain and educate audiences such as this curious crowd.
What did your teacher teach you guys?
I learned that when the Titanic sank, that it split in 2 pieces.
I learned that third class wasn't even allowed to talk to or interact with first class and second people.
Yeah, they really didn't like that too much. They really tried to segregate them away.
Then he shows them how cold it must have been in the icy North Atlantic.
Can you imagine your whole body being in there?
Oh. Has it been 30 seconds?
No.
Oh my God.
The warm air feels so good.
Not too bad?
No.
No?
I switched so.
You know most people didn't die from drowning?
Bergeron's show and tell brings the Titanic story to life, one classroom at a time. But with the 100th anniversary approaching, it's going to be pretty hard to avoid the marketing blitz. Hollywood is also revving up to cash in once again. Led by James Cameron's re-release of his blockbuster Titanic, this time in 3D.
This is it! Hold on!
His is just the latest in a long line of cinematic versions of the tragedy.
Do not let go of my hand!
The fascination with the Titanic story began almost immediately after it sank. This German film, named In Nacht und Eis, or Night and Ice, was the first movie made about the Titanic. Production started just 2 months after the tragedy. While it was short on special effects, it definitely captured the drama and panic.
Die Titanic sinkt. Wir hatten eine Kollision mit Unterwassereis.
30 years later, at the height of World War II, the Nazis released Titanic, in which the disaster served as a metaphor for American and British greed and incompetence. But it would take 4 decades before the Titanic got the full Hollywood treatment.
Did you hear what's happened? We ran into an iceberg and none of us even saw it. Isn't that the biggest cheat?
I knew there was something. It woke me. Norman, get dressed
The 1953 movie starring Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb was a hit, nominated for 2 Oscars and winning 1.
Is there any danger?
Danger? On a ship like this? Oh, nonsense.
Bridget Bradley attended the premiere at a local theater in Kingston, Ontario. She was a third-class passenger aboard the Titanic, fleeing poverty in Ireland for a new life awaiting her in North America with her brother and sister. After the sinking, she survived in a lifeboat and was rescued by the Carpathia. Once she arrived in New York, Bridget shared her experience with a newspaper.
The night was extremely cold, and we women folk had little wraps to keep us warm, and we huddled there in clusters, watching the great ship as she sank.
In the decades that followed, Bridget tried to put the incident behind her. She married Bernard Lachey, but soon was left a widow raising 4 children in Gananoque, Ontario. The movie made her a local celebrity, but it also made her uncomfortable.
And all through the movie, my mother kept shaking her head, as if to say, that's not true, that didn't happen. After the movie, she was taken on stage and honored by the mayor of Gananoque, the mayor of Kingston, and the manager of the theater. And she was given a bouquet of flowers and a lifetime pass to the theater, which she never used.
Can you send and read Morse?
Yes, sir.
Then signal and keep signaling. We are the Titanic sinking. Please have your boats ready.
5 years later, in 1958, there was yet another film, A Night to Remember. It was based on an international bestseller and hooked another generation.
I was watching it with one of my brothers and my father in the basement, and at the end of the movie, I just asked them, "Is this a true story?" And they were like, "Yeah, it's a true story." And just from there on, I just wanted to know more and more.
Not surprisingly, the survivors and their families were less than impressed. Most believed the movies could never come close to the real experience of that night.
I felt that it was romanticizing something that was a family tragedy, and for me, that I wasn't interested in the romantic version of the Titanic sinking.
You know, there's nothing romantic about a disaster. The nobility, the myth of men giving up their... it just didn't happen that way. It was a horror story.
Here's where we go on the map. We're going to go up this way.
And often a horror story best left untold. Valerie Annewalt and Orion Green's great-grandfather was perhaps the most famous Canadian aboard the Titanic. Charles Melville Hayes was president of the Grand Trunk Railway. He was in London to secure funding for an audacious expansion plan to the West Coast. Hayes and his son-in-law drowned. His wife and daughter survived, but in the years that followed, the Titanic was a taboo subject.
See that? There it is right up there. This monument, we never did bring it up, and we did not bring it up because we grew up in an era where you did respect your elders, and when you were told that that would be, it would not be approachable, you didn't do it. I think they internalized. I think they're very personal about that.
But still, everything about the Titanic seemed right for the big screen, and this movie topped the list. In 1997, Canadian director James Cameron took the story of the unsinkable ship, added a tragic love story, and turned it into an unbeatable movie. It cost $200 million and made almost $2 billion worldwide.
It became ingrained in the public mind. It then became mythical, it then became all pervasive. We now had another wave of interest in Titanic, which sparked all kinds of exhibitions across the country. It is now part of pop culture.
Fanning the flames of this new obsession was the fictitious romance between first-class passenger Rose and third-class passenger Jack, played by Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. Titanic elevated the tragedy into the greatest love story ever told. The impact of Cameron's movie was felt around the world. Fans screamed and swooned wherever the movie stars appeared.
How's the volume? Can we hear well?
And it is that obsession with Leonardo DiCaprio that draws tourists to the Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax, where 121 Titanic victims are buried.
Just feet away.
Many are convinced that this grave holds the real Jack Dawson. But according to archivist Gary Shootlock, it's a case of fact and fiction colliding.
Jay Dawson was in reality Joseph Dawson. He was an Irishman. He had been in the military and he was traveling on the ship as a member of the crew. So he was a real character, but he wasn't the character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie.
However, Cameron didn't need to invent a romance. A real one existed, one of the most fascinating and least known Titanic tales, and it had a Canadian connection.
There is no more quintessential Canadian story than that of Quig Baxter, a hockey player from Montreal, and his girlfriend, Bertha Mayney, who was a Belgian cabaret singer.
He was a wealthy playboy. She was from the wrong side of the tracks. By most accounts, they were madly in love. When the Titanic started to sink, he saved her life. Quig was never seen again. Heartbroken, Berthe returned to Europe. Over time, she resumed her career and, according to her family, became a popular fixture on the Belgian social scene.
Elle a connu des gens qui étaient vraiment des gens à gros revenus, donc des notables belges dont les noms sont d'ailleurs connus parce qu'ils ont eu soit des usines, soit des fabriques renommées.
Berthe always had stories about the many men in her life. However, they thought the tale of her long-lost Canadian lover was nothing more than a fantasy.
Et je suis rentré en disant, ben, c'est une vaste comédie, c'est une vaste blague, c'est pas vrai, elle a raconté ça pour se glorifier, tout le monde l'a cru, c'est la belle histoire dans la famille, on raconte ça dès que quelqu'un y entre, évidemment raconter l'histoire de la tante Berthe, sur sa vie au Canada, oui, ça c'est lui, il est dans un canoë.
But after she died, her family discovered the proof in a shoebox hidden among her belongings. There lay the evidence of her romance with Quig Baxter, the man who saved her life when the Titanic went down.
Dans le fond, la famille, il n'y a personne qui y croyait. On a dit, bah non. Mais alors, ils ont retrouvé, et quand elle est décédée, ils ont trouvé des photos, des lettres, ils ont trouvé, donc c'était exact.
These were real people. They had real lives. And it was a romance that I think in many respects rivals or even equals the fictional romance that Cameron created in his movie.
But what happened that night went far beyond the passengers and their personal stories. The ripple effects spread all the way across the country to the end of a rail line in a small British Columbia town. Charles Melville Hayes had a dream.
He hired a landscape architect to lay out a town, and everything was in place in 1910 They named the town Prince Rupert.
And a century later, his far-sighted vision is becoming a reality. For first-class passengers aboard the White Star luxury ships, transatlantic travel was similar to being on a floating luxury hotel. The elegant dining room, the private promenade deck, the handcrafted interiors. The list of those who died on Titanic's maiden voyage was a who's who of North America's business nobility. Millionaires like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, and a railway tycoon who left his mark on Canada. In the early 20th century, Canada was linked by rail ties and steel tracks. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway was a defining moment of our nationhood. But it wasn't long before the CPR had some competitors, and one of them was a transplanted American named Charles Melville Hayes, the head of the Grand Trunk Railway.
Charles Hayes was probably one of the most impressive entrepreneurs of the period. Like Donald Trump in New York, he was a man who believed that he could spend his way out of bankruptcy.
Indeed, a big spender with even bigger ideas. From his sumptuous headquarters in Montreal, Charles Hayes had a plan for train travel and luxurious lodgings.
Charlie had this vision of building a string of hotels across Canada. The Chateau Laurier in Ottawa would be the flagship of this chain. He was basically going to emulate what the CPR had already done, but do it better.
The key to Hayes' scheme was the small northern British Columbia town of Prince Rupert, which he had founded in 1910. Hayes wanted to extend the Grand Trunk Railway from Winnipeg to Prince Rupert because he saw something others didn't.
There's a couple of things that make Prince Rupert desirable. One is the fact that it's got a deep water port, and the other, of course, is that it cuts off shipping time to Asia. Unfortunately, as it's turned out, Hayes was about 100 years ahead of his time.
Charles Hayes never lived to see it all happen. When he went down with the Titanic, his dreams of a railway and a big fancy hotel chain appeared to die with him. But a century later, Charles Hayes' vision is finally paying off. With the deepest natural harbor in North America, Prince Rupert is now the fastest growing container port on the continent. Wherever you walk, there is a reminder of the town's founder, Hayes Mountain, a street named after him, and a statue of the man himself outside City Hall. Prince Rupert never forgot Charles Hayes, and when his great-granddaughter Orion Green visited a few years ago, it was big news.
Everybody knew who Charles Hayes was, and they were astonished that one of his descendants was coming. So I had television interviews and radio interviews and newspaper articles. It was really quite astonishing.
The story still resonates for the next generation in this city. At the high school which bears his name, students know all about Charles Hayes and his far-sighted plans.
Do I know about Charles Hayes? Yes, I know some things. I've read books. I have a book on him at home.
Charles Hayes was on the Titanic when he died, when it sank, and his plans for Prince Rupert were apparently he was going to try and minimize the mountain so it would be smaller, like detonate it and stuff.
I was told that his plans were to build a bridge over from the port to Rigby down on the waterfront. And if he survived, then we'd probably be like a small Vancouver.
If Charles Hayes' business savvy left a mark on Canadian history, then another Titanic passenger did the same in the world of art. Paul Chevret was a middle-aged French sculptor from Asnières, near Paris. His artwork remains in parks and in historic buildings throughout the town. In Quebec, his works still stand outside places like the Chateau Frontenac and the National Assembly. They include pioneers, politicians, and poets. In 1912, Charles Hayes had commissioned Chevret to create a bust of Sir Wilfrid Laurier for his soon-to-be-opened hotel in Ottawa. The two men were on the first-class deck aboard the Titanic. Hayes drowned, while Chevret survived, but it came at a terrible price.
He was a man of respect, a man of tenderness, and he just died from having taken a woman's place in a lifeboat. I think he really couldn't stand that. It just killed him from inside.
Less than 2 years after the Titanic sank, Paul Chevret died. But on his deathbed, he made a request to his father, who was also a sculptor, to finish a project at this church near Quebec City. Chevret had almost completed the statue of Christ, but the face wasn't done.
So his dad decided that he would give his dying sense features to the Christ. And today we can say that the statue is standing just at the entrance of the church. It's the last reminder of Paul Chevret's last hours.
Branson, Missouri. A tourist destination tucked away in the Ozark Mountains. This small Midwestern town features some big landmarks. Including this attraction. It is the Titanic Museum, complete with iceberg and spraying water. Since it opened in 2006, the museum has attracted millions of tourists.
These are some of the last postcards to be issued from the Titanic.
Each room is filled with priceless artifacts and mementos of the ship. The exhibit also has life-size replicas of rooms, the deck, and of course, the grand staircase.
This grand staircase is built exactly to scale. Now, what does that mean? That means
these Titanic descendants are here to connect with their past.
it is exactly the same size.
For some, it's a new experience. They grew up in a very exclusive club where many questions were asked, but few answered. In discovering their past, they learned more about the tragedy.
My goodness, that is my grandmother and her younger brother. Yes.
When you enter the memorial room, find out the fate of the Fortune family.
Yes.
Our family did not talk about this story much, so it's been interesting, a little bit uncomfortable in a way, and of course very sad.
Isn't that amazing?
It is incredible.
Yeah. Oh, just see his picture here.
I know.
Gosh.
He looks so young.
Wow, he was. He was.
Van Solomonian came here for his grandfather. Third-class Armenian passenger Neshan Krikorian was fleeing persecution in Turkey for a better life in Canada. He survived the Titanic disaster through courage and quick wits. Eventually, he moved to St. Catharines, Ontario, where he lived in the same house on the same street for 60 years. It was just meters away from a foundry where he worked to achieve the Canadian dream. Neshan Krikorian welcomed fellow Armenians escaping genocide to a country he now called home. And like Charles Hayes, he helped shape a community.
He was one of the founders of the Armenian Orthodox Church in St. Catharines. I don't know if there was a sense of obligation in terms of, you know, he was a very fortunate person to have survived, and maybe this was some way to, it was almost like payback to society and to his community.
She always did wear pearls, but not in that picture.
Robert Rutherford's grandmother, Alice Fortune, was part of a prominent Winnipeg family. She was returning home to get married. Alice survived the tragedy. Her father and brother didn't. Robert Rutherford and his wife remember being told how the Titanic affected her wedding.
The family tradition says that she was married in a black dress because she was still in mourning, and of course her trousseau was no longer to be had.
Over the years, the Rutherfords have taken in every bit of the Titanic story, something Robert Rutherford believes his grandmother would want.
If she was here today, she would be extremely impressed with the attempt to keep that terrible event alive for the posterity's sake.
Well, I just find it amazing finding this letter, because that's the letter I used for the inspiration of my film.
At the museum, filmmaker Astra Burka encounters a display about her great-great-uncle.
Well, I find it very strange that it's in a foreign location that isn't part of our family, but yeah, I just find it actually quite strange, a little odd. And where is that dropped? Oh, right here.
Just right.
As a child, my mother always told me stories about her great-uncle.
Having lost his precious cargo aboard the Titanic, Adolf Saalfeld never ran a perfume business again. Astra Burka hopes her film will be a fitting legacy.
I think my family will be proud of it because I brought life to Uncle Adolf, and I think he deserves it.
So please make your way to Titanic's Memorial Room wall and find your family.
And it is here where family members come face to face with the full weight of the tragedy.
One here, one here. That's 4.
Oh, so he wasn't alone from his family.
Oh, yes.
Very interesting. Look at Suzette Douglas. What exotic name.
2,200 names, 2,200 stories. And as they search for their loved ones, these descendants are united in their loss.
Yes, that's my grandmother right there.
She was 24 only.
Yes.
You'll find real red rose petals here. I would ask that you now make your way. Select one real red rose petal. Bring it to this
Then a special ceremony to honor the memory of their loved ones. Millions of rose petals have already been collected by the museum, and on the anniversary, they will be scattered at the exact spot where the unsinkable ship disappeared.
I was thinking of my great-grandfather, who was lost in the Titanic, Mark Fortune.
It's very moving to enter such a room where the names of people who had just been misspelled names in newspapers for decades are written forever now. It's very moving, very, very strange to see that history has become real now.
I was thinking that I would like to have had a rose petal for each one of the members of our family and their entourage who had gone. So the one petal represents all of them.
Dreams and memories may eventually be all that is left of the Titanic. The great ship itself is slowly disintegrating at the bottom of the ocean. French diver P.H. Nargeolet saw this for himself when he went back to the site in 2010.
We saw a lot of deterioration, and of course it's more visible. We saw the deck, they are starting to fall down. You know, soon you will have no more deck, everything will collapse.
And despite Nargeolet's 30 dives to the Titanic, perhaps the greatest question of them all remains unanswered.
I really want to know why and how the Titanic sank. For me, there are still things to discover on the Titanic. You know? It's still a possibility.
The Titanic may soon be gone, but these families are a link to its past. The stories they learned as children will be passed on to their future generations. Tales of courage, romance, and hardship. The men, women, and children who crossed the ocean that April night in 1912 believed they were safe until it was too late.
The Titanic is an epic drama. It plays itself out in 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I think it resonates because each of us, at one point of our life or another, find ourselves standing on the sloping deck of the Titanic.
I think I'm going to come away with a much greater understanding of the huge tragedy that it was to all of the survivors and those who died alike. It had to have been a horrific experience.
The question is, are survivors really survivors? Did they really survive the sinking of the ship? It is very important to wonder about the fact that you may not really survive such an event.